Okay.
Okay, just half a second. There we are. Okay. Good to see you after my being away for a couple of weeks, and we have an interesting take on today's daf. Daf Mem Zayin Amud Beis we're going to be dealing with a Mishnah first on Amud Aleph, and then the continuation of the Gemara on Amud Beis. So the Mishnah talks about an unusual case where a man dumps some fruit into his neighbor's yard. I guess that's not all that unusual. That could happen. He wants to get rid of it, so instead of putting it in his own garbage, he puts it in the yard of his neighbor. But what then happens is that the neighbor's animal comes and eats up the fruit. So the Mishnah says, quite obviously, the neighbor is not responsible for the consumption of the fruit because he had no right to put the fruit there in the first place. And therefore, if the neighbor's animal ate the fruit is gone, the neighbor doesn't have to compensate him for it. The interesting case is im huska bahen, if the neighbor's animal damages itself as a result of this fruit. Then Baal HaPeirot Chayav, the owner of the fruit, does have to pay. The question is, how did this animal cause itself damage? So the Gemara says on the next page, Omar Rav says, Lo shanu ela shuhuch lekabahen. The case that we're talking about, where the person who dumped the fruit is responsible for the damage to the animal, is only if the animal slipped on the fruit, hurt itself physically on the fruit. Aval achala, but if that animal ate the fruit and became ill and died as a result of eating the fruit, patur, then the person who dumped the fruit there is patur. So again, I dump a whole lot of fruit into your yard. Your animal eats my fruit. You don't have to compensate me for the fruit that the animal ate, of course. But if your animal then gets ill as a result of having eaten the fruit, then I don't have to pay. I'm free from paying, even though I had no right to put the fruit there in the first place. My timer, what is the reason? The Gemara says something very unusual. Havala shelo tuchal. I can't think of another case where the Gemara holds the animal responsible. Havala shelo tuchal. The animal should not have eaten it. Fruit is not a natural thing for an animal to eat. An animal instinctually knows what's good for it and what's bad for it. And in this particular case, the animal shouldn't have eaten the fruit. So I, who put the fruit in the neighbor's yard in the first place, I am patur. I'm not responsible for that. That's what the Gemara says. Now we're going to look at two different approaches to what this means that the animal is responsible. What does it mean that the person who put the fruit there in the first place is not responsible? I have no right to dump my fruit in your yard. Without permission, I dump my fruit in your yard. Your animal innocently eats my fruit. It doesn't know any better. It doesn't know whose fruit it is. And it becomes ill and dies as a result of eating that fruit. I'm patur. Why is that? So we're going to look at the Rosh and at Tosfot as two different approaches to what this is about. Says the Rosh, if the animal slips on the fruit, then the neighbor is responsible. But if the animal overate the fruit, then the neighbor is not responsible. The person who dumped the fruit there is not responsible. My time, the animal should not have eaten. Explains the Rosh. Since the animal deliberately did something damaging to itself, animals know how to keep away from damage, but this animal didn't. This animal went ahead and ate fruit that it had no right to eat and caused itself damage. Ein lechayev bala perot bekach. For that reason, you're not going to hold the owner of the fruit responsible for this animal doing something stupid. But then the Rosh goes on to explain. When I put my fruit into your yard, I am not expected to have considered the possibility that your animal might eat my fruit, because animals don't do that. And since it's an unlikely event that an animal would eat the fruit, I don't have to worry about that. I dumped my fruit into your yard. So, and that's a different thing. It was wrong of me to do that. I had no permission to do that. All of that we're not dealing with. Just on the question of the animal's responsibility and my responsibility to predict, to be able to foresee that this animal might eat the fruit, and therefore I should be careful, I'm not expected to do that. Because it is unusual for an animal to overeat. Humans overeat. Animals don't overeat. Animals generally know how much they need to eat, and they eat according to what they need, and they very seldom, if ever, eat more than they need. And therefore, there was no reason, I'm not expected to have foreseen this as a possibility and to have taken steps to prevent it. And since I'm not expected to have taken steps to prevent it, I'm not responsible if it happened. And therefore, v'al ba'al hachatzer mutal shmira zu. So who should have taken care to see that the animal doesn't overeat? If anybody, the owner of the yard, the owner of the animal should have taken care. Because he hangs out in the yard. He sees what's going on. He notices that the fruit's been dumped. He notices that his animal is eating the fruit. And he notices that the animal is eating too much of the fruit. He should have intervened. And if he sees his animal eating too much, he should have stepped in. But whatever the case, I, who dumped the fruit there in the first place, could not be expected to have foreseen the possibility that the animal would overeat the fruit. That's the case as the Rosh sees it. And the Pilpula Charifta adds, the Pilpula Charifta is a very important parish on the Rosh. He was the Rov in Brisk in about the 17th century. Brisk has always had amazing Rabbanim. Of course, we had the Beis Halevi was in Brisk, the Brisker Rov was, Reb Chaim was in Brisk, the Brisker Rov was in Brisk. All the Soloveitchiks came from Brisk. They were the Rabbanim of Brisk. And the Pilpula Charifta before the Soloveitchiks was the Rov of Brisk. And he writes an important parish on the Rosh. And the Rosh himself, of course, is like the end of the school of the Tosfot. The Rosh is in the 13th century, beginning of the 14th century, comes from Europe to Spain, and he brings the whole system of the Tosfot, landing up at the end with psakim, with actual halachic summaries that we're able to extrapolate from the Gemara using the Tosfotist methodology. And the Pilpula Charifta says, Mishum di ilav hachi ela silek nafsho michatzero legamri. Because if we're not talking about this case, but if we're talking about a case where the owner's not there, the owner of the yard and the owner of the animal, he's gone on vacation or he's gone away for the weekend. And this person just put his fruit there and there's nobody looking after the yard. Clearly, in such a case, where the neighbor knows that the owner of the yard, the owner of the ox, is not in the yard, is not on the premises, in such a case, clearly the person who puts the fruit there is obligated to take care of it and make sure that the owner's animal doesn't eat it. Even if it's unlikely, he's still responsible. Like this case where the animal ate too much. This is an important thing that the Pilpula Charifta says in explaining the Rosh. The animal can't be blamed because the animal doesn't have the capacity to know what's too much to eat. So the Pilpula Charifta explaining the Rosh says at the end of the day, the animal needs an owner. The animal needs somebody to watch it. We can't always assume that the animal keeps away from what's bad for it. But tzarich la'adam she'imna'ena, and it needs a person, a human that stops it. And it's possible that the Pilpula Charifta, and in this case the Rosh, hold that there's a difference between domesticated animals and wild animals. Wild animals have alert instincts. They know what to eat and what not to eat. But animals that are brought up in captivity by humans tend to rely on people to provide their food for them and tend to rely on people to know what's good for them and what isn't good for them. And therefore, this animal needs human supervision. the assumption is that its owner, the Baal HaChatzer, the owner of the yard, is going to be the supervisor. However, if the Baal HaChatzer is not there, clearly the neighbor who dumped the fruit there into the yard should be careful and should be able to foresee that there is a danger that this animal might eat the fruit. That's the view of the Rosh, as expanded on by the Pepula Harifta. Are there any questions on the scenario, by the way, before we go into Tosfot?
I'm not sure I understand why the neighbor is allowed to put stuff in the yard and the fellow whose yard it is responsible. I understand that he has to watch his animal and stuff like that, but at best, the guy who owns the animals is shomer chinam, right? I mean, he didn't tell the guy to put the stuff in the yard. He didn't give him permission. So why would he possibly have any kind of responsibility even to watch his own animal, right? Why would he even have a hasaga to think that there's food in the thing that the animal shouldn't eat?
A great question, and Tosfot really asks that question. If you look at the next piece that I bring, which is Tosfot, he says, "Ein lefaresh de lekach patur, de chashiv kuruach she'ena metzuya, d'halekamei amrin chayev gabi hayaocher chitin v'triz omet mishum de b'shut mekabel netirut umar bekach malo shomer chinam patur beruach she'ena metzuya." A shomer chinam is patur. The question really is even whether we consider the person who dumped the fruit there as a shomer chinam. In other words, having to take care of the owner's animal. Your question about his right to dump the fruit there, of course he doesn't have the right to dump the fruit there. Of course he did wrong. And in a sense, any damage that comes to that. But let's just do the Tosfot. Let's look at the Tosfot's view, which I think deals with what you're concerned around a little bit more directly. Because if you look at the next piece of the Tosfot, the part that I've bolded, Elahainu timer, the reason is Kivan shebemitkavein mevi alav davar shemeziko. Since the animal makes a choice to do something damaging to its own health, eno ra'ui ze lehitchayev bekach, the other person is not responsible. Tosfos is saying something very different from the Rosh. The Rosh is saying this is a question of who should be expected to predict the damage. And we say it's whoever is there. If the owner of the field is there, he should be the one to predict. You write that in a sense, the person who put the fruit there has caused the damage. But if you look at the next piece that I bring, which is the Tosfot Rid, he says, V'zeh shesama peirot lefanav, lo asa ela grama ba'alma. That's just groma. I put fruit in the yard and now the animal eats the fruit. That's groma. So I'll be chayav b'dinei shamayim. Hashem will hold me responsible for that. But a Beit Din can't require me to pay the damages because that was indirect damage. That was just a groma. The actual initiation of the damage was by the animal itself. It would be something like a person is driving down the road at a normal speed and driving carefully, doing nothing wrong. And a dog runs into the road in front of the car and gets run over. That's not the driver who caused the death of the dog. That's the dog did it itself. The dog was careless. He ran in front of the car. The driver did nothing. In the same here, yes, the person who dumped the fruit did something morally wrong and indirectly caused damage for which Hashem holds him responsible. But from the perspective of a Beit Din, we say the initiation of the damage was by the animal and thereby the owner of the animal has to take legal responsibility for his animals. So Tosfos has an interesting view. Tosfos says here, an animal can actually decide to do something that isn't instinctual. It's an amazing chiddush really in the Rambam, that not everything an animal does is instinctual. An animal can decide to do something against its instinct. And in this case, for an animal to overeat or to eat something which is damaging to its health is not something that an animal generally does. So what Tosfot is looking at is not who is responsible for having failed to anticipate the damage, which is the way the Rosh looks at it. The Rosh looks at failure. Who failed to think about this? Whose responsibility was it to realize this animal could eat it and somebody should intervene? Says the Rosh, it's not the person who dumps the fruit there. It's the person who's in the yard all the time. Says Tosfot, that's not the issue. The issue is not anticipating whether the animal will do this or not. Nobody has to anticipate that an animal is going to do this. It's not the kind of thing an animal normally does. The mechanism we use to decide who is chayav is who triggered the damage. At what point did the damage get triggered? It didn't get triggered by putting the fruit there, because that's indirect. Nothing needed to happen. There was no inevitable consequence from putting the fruit there. The chances are nothing would happen at all. The fruit would be there. The owner of the yard would get upset with his neighbor. He would yell at his neighbor, throw the fruit back in the neighbor's yard, and that would be the end of the story. It's not necessary that damage would result. So the dumping of the fruit, as the Tosfos Reed says, is grama. That's indirect damage. It's not direct damage. The trigger of the damage really was the animal itself. The animal's choice to overeat, that was the trigger, and therefore the owner of the animal is chayav, not the neighbor, is the way Tosfot sees it. And this is, Tosfot is explaining in the most literal way the statement of the Gemara, Havala shelo tochal. It ought not to have eaten. That we actually, it's not as if we hold the animal responsible. Of course, the animal's not responsible. The owner of the animal is responsible. But we say until that moment that the animal chose to eat, there was no inevitability to the damage. There was no certainty that because I dumped my fruit there, the animal was going to die. That's grammar. What started the problem was the animal's choice to eat. And therefore, it's not the neighbor who is responsible. It's the owner of the animal who must take responsibility for his own animal. That's the difference in approach between Tosfot and the Rosh in this piece of Gemara. Does that make a little more sense, Alan? You're on mute, sorry.
No, it makes sense, but
doesn't seem fair, does it?
Exactly. I'm saying, let's say you take the same scenario, but I go ahead and I set a trap on your field. You have this very large field, and I set a trap at the end of the field, and then the animal wanders over during the course of the day and gets killed by the trap or whatever it is. So it's the same thing. It's a grumma, and I'm not responsible because you should have been looking after your animal in your field. And I understand what you're saying. It just doesn't compute.
It's a very interesting point that you're making, and the Rishonim discuss whether the issue here is bor or esh. What kind of damage is this? The example you've given of the trap is definitely bor. So I come and I dig a pit in your yard. That's designed for mischief. That's designed for damage. It's intended for damage. It's designed for damage. So there, I'm definitely chayav. But here it's not so. It's just food under normal circumstances. An animal's not going to eat it under normal circumstances. Maybe I need to pay you rent for using your place. Maybe I need to pay you damages because the fruit rots or whatever. But I certainly am not responsible directly for the fact that your crazy animal overate itself on some peaches. Fred?
I think you added a word which the Mishnah doesn't use, and that's the reason why the animal died. You said he overate. Generally, the Gemara assumes that animals do not overeat. They eat what they have to. Humans overeat, as you said earlier. Humans overeat, animals don't. However, the animal is derech, the behemoth, to eat. So if it's a fruit that it usually eats, then I would think that the animal is not making a choice, and the animal is responsible, because that's the derech of an animal. However, the person, I don't know if it's grumma, because yes, he didn't kill the animal with his hands, but if he shoots a gun, the gun killed it. No, the fruit killed it. So it seems to me it's not really grumma. If it's the derech of the animal to eat, and the animal ate something he generally eats, but for whatever reason it was poisoned or who knows what, it has some stones in it or whatever. But you said overeating. That's not what the Mishnah says, and that's not the way the Gemara usually defines why an animal eats.
So we have a machlokes Fred and Tosfos Reed. All right, we have a difference of opinion between Fred and Tosfos Reed. The Tosfos Reed says it's Groma Ba'alma, and Fred says it isn't Groma Ba'alma. So let's try and understand the Tosfos Reed. Fred is easy to understand. Let's understand the Tosfos Reed. It's for that reason that the Rosh says overeat. You're right, the Mishnah doesn't say overeat. The Rosh says, but then it would make no sense for the very reason you're saying. If an animal eats, that's what it normally does. So what is the problem? That's why the Rosh says, it must be talking about a case where it overate, not a case where it ate. If it ate, then absolutely he would be chayav. If it ate something and it was poisoned or whatever, and the animal got ill just by eating something normal, that's very different. Here we're talking about a case it shouldn't have eaten, says the Rosh. That must mean it shouldn't have overeaten. If we don't take it to be overeaten, if we just, because Tosfos doesn't say overeaten, it's just the Rosh who says overeaten. Tosfos might be talking about a case where the fruit is something which the animal doesn't usually eat. It's not the kind of fruit that an animal would eat. And that's why, whatever the case is, it must be talking about something that the animal would not normally do. If this is something the animal would normally do, the Mishnah and the Gemara would be very, very different. So the Rosh says the reason is because the animal overate. Tosfos might be holding because it's a type of fruit an animal would never normally eat, and that way we resolve the machlokes Fred and Tosfos Reed, and the Gemara and the Rosh and the Rosh then make more sense. We now take a complete aside and look at a very interesting application of this Gemara. And the application is by the Shem Mishmuel. The Shem Mishmuel, as you probably know, was the second Sochotchover Rebbe. The first Sochotchover Rebbe was the Avnei Nezer, the Iglei Tal, one of the great minds of the 19th century. And the second, his son, who was also a grandson of the Kotzker Rebbe, these are people with great Hasidic yichus, was the Shem Mishmuel. What's interesting is, despite the well-known differences between the Vilna Gaon and the Hasidim and the school of the Vilna Gaon, our school of yeshivish learning and the Hasidim, it's interesting to know and important to notice that a lot of the works of the Hasidic Rabbeim are incorporated into the yeshivish canon. We learn the Avnei Nezer, and we learn the Sfas Emes, and we learn the Chidushei Harim, the Geira Rebbe, the later Geira Rebbe, the Sochotchover Rebbe. These are all powers that we use. The Vilna Gaon was never opposed to that aspect of Hasidism. Where Hasidism comes into question in the eyes of the yeshivish movement, of the learning movement, is when they use Kabbalah to try and resolve. When you've got a rational issue in the Gemara that needs to be resolved and you use a Kabbalistic approach, that's where the great Rosh Yeshivas had difficulties. But if you look at the works of the Chidushei Harim and the Avnei Nezer and the Sfas Emes, there is absolutely no Chasidus in their understanding of Gemara. There's absolutely no Kabbalah in the understanding of the Gemara. They are as meticulous in the logic and rationality of the Gemara as any of the regular Lithuanian Rosh Yeshivas are. In addition, they wrote word. The Sfas Emes wrote a work on the Chumash, and there you'll have Chassidus. The Shem Mishmuel writes his work on the Chumash, and there is Chassidus and there is Kabbalah. In this particular case, he's not using Chassidus to make sense of the Gemara. He's using the Gemara to make sense of an issue in the Chumash. The case is in Parshat Matot, where Moshe instructs the Bnei Israel to go and avenge the Midianites, who were the cause of the plague of the enormous loss of Jewish life. They come back from having avenged the Midianites, and Moshe discovers they've left the women alive. The army comes back and Moshe gets angry. Did you really leave the women alive? How could you have done that? The women are the ones who got Bilam involved. Nimsor mal ba'Hashem al davar Peor. They seduced the men into the service of Peor, Avodah Zarah, into that idolatry. And the result of that was a tremendous plague among the nations of Hashem. And they were responsible for that. How could you have left them alive? I always think it's quite interesting when you look at that piece of Chumash and you look at the world is getting a little impatient with us as to what we're doing to Gaza after Gaza caused such terrible physical devastation on October the 7th and killed so many of our people. Can you imagine what the world would think if we attacked Gaza or anybody else because they led us astray, because they caused us to forsake the Torah, because they misled us into serving false gods, and we declare war on them? Imagine what the world would have to say if that were the case, if we declared war on Germany because they were responsible for the original reform movement that led so many Jews into astray, so we declare war on them and bomb them to pieces. But in those days, there was such moral clarity that to attack a nation's morality was as serious as to attack them physically. For a nation to threaten us spiritually, we considered that as serious as a physical threat. And we were instructed by Moshe to go and wipe the Midianites out, but we left the women alive. Moshe is very upset. Says the Shem Mishmur, what the Shem Mishmur is concerned about here is that the Midianites did two things to us. Firstly, the women seduced the men, and so there was Gilui Arayot, the men misbehaved themselves sexually. And secondly, there was Avodah Zarah. They caused us to follow Baal Peor. When Moshe gets angry at the men, at the army, for leaving the women alive, what is he angry about? He's angry because the women were responsible for the Avodah Zarah. He makes no mention about the fact that they seduced the men to be immoral in their conduct. Why doesn't he mention that as well? Why doesn't he say, Hein, hayu livnei Israel? They were for the Jewish people. They seduced them and they misled them and they caused them to serve idolatry. Why is there no mention of the sexual side of it? It explains the Shem Shmuel. We use our Gemara here that we've just learned. Even if you put poison fruit in front of a friend's animal, you're only chayav b'dinei shemayim. It's grama. It's indirect damage because the animal shouldn't eat it. The animal knows not to eat poison. And the Gemara says even fruit which animals do eat, nami patu. If the animal overeats, it's also patu. Mishum havala shelo techal. Because the animal shouldn't have eaten. V'ayin b'tosfot sham, see what Tosfot says. V'im kain. Elu shehizminu atzman lifnei Yisrael kadei sheyikashlu bahen, ein alehen din b'dinei adam. And so these women who set themselves up as snares, as moral snares for Bnei Yisrael, for the men of Yisrael, they're no worse than the man who dumped the fruit in their neighbor's yard. The animal still is free not to eat. The animal knows it's not good for it and it shouldn't eat it. So too, a Jew knows that he has the Torah. He shouldn't be following these attractive girls into immoral behavior. And the Jewish men are responsible for it themselves. Yes, certainly the women who seduce them are not exactly innocent. But Moshe isn't angry at them for that. For that, he's angry at the Jewish people. The men, you should not have followed them. I'm not saying you should wipe out the women of Midian because they misled you. You allowed yourself to be misled. I'm only saying you need to wipe them out because they led you into idolatrous worship. Moshe Rabbeinu alav hashalom chidesh lahem hatinach b'chatat haznut. That's all applicable to znut, to sexual impropriety. But in addition to that, they seduced them into serving idolatry. And when a person seduces a Jew into idol worship, we don't find any arguments in favor of the seducer. Anybody who persuades you, so if a person comes to Ra'anana and he gets up and he's a very charismatic speaker and he persuades the Jews of Ra'anana to serve idolatry, and we do, and then we get into trouble. Beis Din comes and we get into trouble, and the man says, we point at this man and we know what the din is. He's guilty of death. His defense is, you didn't have to listen to me. I told you to serve idolatry. God told you not to. Why did you listen to me? We don't accept that claim. And what I want to look at with you now is why that is so. Why, if somebody seduces individuals into serving idolatry, is he responsible rather than the people who serve the idolatry? Of course, the people who serve the idolatry have culpability as well. But why is the seducer put to death? Why can't he claim, I just put my views forward. I think this was a good thing to do. The people were fully entitled and able not to listen to me if they follow Hashem. Exactly as we say with this animal. The animal didn't have to eat the fruit. The Bnei Israel didn't have to follow the women, the Midianite women. They could have stayed at home as loyal husbands. They didn't have to go and follow them and do what they did. And we hold them responsible, not the women. Why, when it comes to intellectual seduction, do we hold the seducer responsible? And what's important to understand here is something that is uniquely Jewish. And that is, and it's a principle we have in the previous daf of our Masechta as well. For example, we had in yesterday's daf the machloket, the very famous machloket, Sumchus and Rabbanon, machloket between Sumchus and the rabbis as to whether, when one is in doubt as to who owns a piece of property, what do you do? So two people are holding on to something. Two people have a claim on something. We don't know whose it is. Sumchus says you split it 50-50. The Rabbanan say the person who has physical hold on it retains his rights of possession until the other person can prove otherwise. So this idea in halakha is that an intellectual proof can change reality. So, for example, if I'm living in my house and you come along and you say the house is mine, we don't listen to you. We say, if the house is yours, bring proof. But if you do bring proof, I've lived in this house for 20 years, and you bring proof that the house is yours. The proof is a concept. The proof is an idea. My occupation is physical. In halakha, an idea is even more powerful than physical reality. And that's a very Jewish idea, that for us, ideas are enormously powerful. We are totally seduced by intellect, by ideas, by philosophies. For a Jew, a philosophy is real. It's not just a philosophy. Shabbat is a philosophy. It's not a physical thing. And we've given our lives for Shabbat because it's an idea that we're willing to give our lives for. Monotheism is an idea. We give our lives for monotheism. Jews will give their lives for an idea. And this is partially why Jews were at the forefront of communism and socialism and nowadays progressive liberalism. When there's an idea that is seductive, Jews latch onto it. Jews love ideas. And for us, ideas are real. We argue over ideas. We debate ideas. We live by ideas. And we die by ideas. And so if a woman comes along and seduces a man, we say the man is trained in how to deal with his Yetzer Hara. That's something we know how to do. We're trained from early childhood that we have a Yetzer Hara, and how do you master your Yetzer Hara? We don't always succeed, but we know how to deal with it. We know what to do. And if we do give into our Yetzer Hara, we are responsible because we've made a choice. We've allowed ourselves to do it. We can't just say, what can we do? It's our Yetzer Hara, tough luck. And so if these women come and they seduce the young men of Israel, we don't just say they couldn't help it. What could they do? They were very beautiful and seductive women. No, the man has the ability to say no. The same as Yosef said with Eshet Potiphar, she tried everything to seduce him and to threaten him. Vayemain Yosef. Yosef said, no, can't do this. We have that capacity. But when it comes to intellectual seduction, the Jew is at his weakest. When it comes to intellectual seduction, we find it very, very hard to resist. And that's when why when the Reform movement came along, even when Christianity came along, and put an intellectual argument to an abandonment of Torah beliefs, the Jew finds it difficult to resist an intellectual argument unless he can see the flaw in the argument. But if the argument is seductive, we easily become seduced by intellectual arguments. And we see this here in this piece of the Shem Mishmur. Yes, an animal is held responsible for eating the fruit. The animal should instinctually know that it shouldn't eat the fruit, and we hold it responsible. The Jewish people should instinctually know that you don't follow the beautiful women, you do what's right according to the Torah. But when it comes to Mesit or Mediach, when it comes to somebody using the Jews' weakness and strength, our biggest strength is our minds, and our biggest weakness is our mind. That's our strength and our weakness. Our mind gives us all the power that we have, and our mind gives us all the weaknesses that we have. And that's why the learning of Gemara has been such an important part of Jewish life, to learn how to use the mind, to learn how to reason, to learn how to find a flaw in an argument, to learn how to understand minute differences, things that look the same but aren't the same, things that look different but in fact aren't different. To be able to make those very, very fine distinctions in reasoning is something that we're trained from early childhood in learning Talmud, because it's such an important part of Jewish life. And if we get it wrong, if we aren't well schooled in how to find the flaw in logic, we tend to be seduced by all sorts of trends and fads that have some kind of a logical argument to them. That's the din that we have in the Mesit Mediach, and that's a beautiful example of learning this principle as the Shem Mishmur does, just in passing from our Gemara today, from the piece that we've learned in the Tosfos and the Mishnah and in the Gemara. So if you look at it, we've traveled from the time of the Mishnah, which is the 2nd century, through to Tosfos in the 13th century, and the Rosh in the 13th century, through to the Shem Mishmuel in the 20th century, already early 20th century. The Shem Mishmuel, interestingly enough, although he was a very obviously Haredi, a very meticulous Rebbe, he was a businessman until he became the Sochotchova Rebbe, and he died just after the Balfour Declaration. And the Balfour Declaration in 1926 excited him. He got very, very excited. He saw that as the beginning of something new. And his son actually came on Aliyah in the 1930s and lived in Tel Aviv. He had many children. He had 2 marriages and many children. Most of them were killed. Nearly all of them were killed in the Holocaust. But one son came to Tel Aviv and lived in Tel Aviv. And his son, he had a son who actually fell in the Milchemet HaAtzmaut, in the War of Independence up near Afula. So we always have this picture of this false polarization of Haredim and Dati Leumi and Chilonim. It's all a very artificial distinction. Many of the Haredi Rosh Yeshivas were very Zionistic. Many of the Dati Leumi are very Haredi. We must start training ourselves not to think in that way, and to find other ways. That was the Shem Mishmur, just in passing, but a great example of a conversation over a period of more than almost 2 millennia that we're able to discuss in 45 minutes here and understand what the issues are and how to apply them right to modern relevance. Let's leave it there, and if there are any questions, happy to take them in the few minutes that we have left.
What you were talking about, the ability to think of ideas, and how we learn Gemara, the term today generally used is critical thinking. Jews are good at critical thinking, and that's why you have some yeshiva talmidim go take the bar to get into law, who never went to college, and they excel because they're good at critical thinking because of all their training and learning Gemara.
Yeah, absolutely, Fred. You're right, and that's there is a lot of the Jews really invented critical thinking, isn't there? Talmud is critical thinking. That's what it was, and we've been doing it for thousands of years.
Right. By the way, the Balfour Declaration was 1917.
was 1917. Interesting.
Yes.
So he was excited at the Balfour Declaration. Thanks for that. He died in 1926.
Yeah.
But of course, you're right. The Balfour Declaration was well before that.
Yeah. Thank you very much. It was a really stimulating and excellent year. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Fred. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Lapin. I'm just reminding everyone, next week is our officially the last meeting of this semester. We'll be having Be'ezat Hashem the next semester, but it will be a few weeks. It will be a while before we start, because I hope that next semester we'll be able to start in person in the base medrash. So it might take a few weeks to arrange, but next week we are still meeting. So hopefully we'll see you next week still on Zoom. And after that, we'll reconvene at the next semester, Bezat Hashem, a few weeks later. So thank you very much. We'll now take a short break, and we'll reconvene at 11 o'clock for the next year. 11 o'clock.
Thank you very much.
See you in a minute. See you in a moment. Thank you.